pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Terence McKenna. With the release of his captivating new book, True Hallucinations, Terence McKenna has given many of us renewed hope that the philosopher's stone as fungus is finally within modernity's reach.
During this sleepless period, I sat one night on this laundry rock below the police house where Dennis was incarcerated, and he was more or less incarcerated because he refused to keep his clothes on, and anything put in a room with him he would hurl out the window. He even hurled the window frame out the window. So he was thorough. I said nothing to anyone, but I formed the resolve not to spend that sleepless night as I had spent the others, wandering the fields like the fox spirit or meditating at the Chorro. Rather, I would sit here where the lake emptied and the Agara-Paraná resumed its languid course, here at the boat landing, 70 feet down a steep mud bank from the river house. I would sit through the night and watch. And so, all night long, I sat reviewing the things that had passed, seeming to divide my consciousness and send it both backward through my family tree and forward into the future. I seemed to see all the years ahead. I saw some technique emerging from this contact, which I now think is the technique for growing Stropharia cubensis. Our careers pursued across space and time, and finally vindication as the world realized the truth of the transdimensional nature of the Stropharia visions and the true nearness of the worlds that they had thrown open. For it had become my belief that the contact with an intelligent and utterly alien species was beginning for humanity. It seemed that out of the long night of cosmic time, the novelty of novelties, the moment of contact between minds on utterly different planes was beginning. We were among the first to achieve contact with this other species. It was the real thing. We had come to the equatorial jungle to explore the dimensions glimpsed in tryptamine ecstasy, and there in the darkness of the heart of the Amazon, we had been found and touched by this bizarre and ancient life form that was now awakening to the global potential of a symbiotic relationship with technical humanity. All night long, strange vistas and insights poured through me. I saw gigantic machineries and worlds of vegetable and mechanical forms on scales inconceivably vast. Time, agatized and glittering, seemed to pour by me like living superfluids inhabiting dream regions of terrible pressure and super cold. And I saw the plan, the mighty plan, at last. It was an ecstasy, an ecstasis that lasted hours and placed the seal of completion on all of my previous life. At the end, I felt reborn, but as what? I knew not. In the gray of a false dawn, the wave of internal imagery faded away. I rose from where I had been sitting for hours and stretched. The sky was clear, but it was still very early and stars were still shining dimly in the west. In the southeast, the direction from toward which my attention had been focused, the sky was clear except for a line of fog or ground mist lying parallel to the horizon only a few feet above the treetops on the other side of the river, perhaps a half a mile away. As I stretched and stood up on the flat stone where I had been sitting, I noticed that the line of fog seemed to have grown darker and now seemed to be churning or rolling in place. I watched very carefully as the rolling line of darkening mist split into two parts, and each of these smaller clouds also divided apart. It took only a minute or so for these changes to be executed, and I was now looking at 4 lens-shaped clouds of the same size lying in a row and slightly above the horizon, only a half mile or so away. A wave of excitement swept through me, followed by a wave of definite fear, I was glued to the spot, unable to move, as if in a dream. As I watched, the clouds recoalesced in the same way they had divided apart, taking another few minutes. The symmetry of this dividing and rejoining, and the fact that the smaller clouds were all the same size, lent the performance an eerie air, as if nature herself were suddenly the tool of some unseen organizing agency. As the clouds recoalesced, they seemed to grow even darker and more opaque. As they all became one, the clouds seemed to swirl inward like a tornado or a waterspout, and it flashed into my mind that perhaps it was a waterspout, something I still have never seen. But even as the thought formed, I heard a high-pitched, ululating whine come drifting over the jungle treetops, obviously from the direction of the thing I was watching. I turned and gave one glance at the river house 70 feet behind me and up the steep hill, gauging whether I had time to run and awaken someone to get confirmation of what was happening. To arouse someone, I would have had to go hand over hand up the slope and consequently take my eyes off the thing I was watching. In the space of an instant, I decided that I could not cease observing. I tried to shout, but no sound came from my fear-constricted throat. The siren sound was gaining pitch, and in fact, everything seemed to be speeding up. The moving cloud was definitely growing larger rapidly, moving straight toward the place where I was. I felt my legs turn to water and sat down, shaking terribly. For the first time, I truly believed in all that had happened to us, and I knew that the flying concrescence was now about to take me. Its details seemed to solidify as it approached. Then it passed directly overhead at an altitude of about 200 feet, banked steeply upward, and was lost from sight over the edge of the slope behind me. In the last moment before it was lost, I completely threw open my senses to it and saw it very clearly. It was a saucer-shaped machine, rotating slowly, with unobtrusive, soft blue and orange lights. As it passed over me, I could see symmetrical indentations on the underside. It was making the whee, whee, whee sound of science fiction flying saucers. My emotions were all in a jumble. At first I was terrified, but the moment I knew that whatever was in the sky was not going to take me, I felt disappointment. I was amazed, and I was trying to remember what I had seen as clearly as possible. Was it real in the naive sense in which that question is asked of UFOs and tables and chairs? No one else saw this thing, as far as I know. I alone was its observer. I believe that had there been other observers, they would have seen essentially what I have reported. But as for real, who can say? I saw this thing go from being a bit of cloud to being a rivet-studded aircraft of some kind. Was it more true to itself as cloud or aircraft? Was it a hallucination? Against my testimony can be put my admitted lack of sleep and our involvement with psychedelic plants. Yet curiously, this last point can be interpreted in my favor. I am familiar through direct experience with most classes of hallucinogens. What I saw that morning did not fall into any of the categories of hallucinated imagery I am familiar with. Yet also against my testimony is the inevitable, incongruous detail that seems to render the whole incident absurd. It is that, as the saucer passed overhead, I saw it clearly enough to judge that it was identical with the UFO with 3 half-spheres on its underside that appears in an infamous photo by George Adamski, widely assumed to be a hoax. I had not closely followed the matter, but I accepted the expert opinion that what Adamski had photographed was a rigged-up end cap of a Hoover vacuum cleaner. But I saw this same object in the sky above La Chorrera. Was it a fact picked up as a boyhood UFO enthusiast? Something as easily picked out of my mind as other memories seem to have been? My stereotyped but already debunked notion of a UFO suddenly appears in the sky. By appearing in a form that casts doubt on itself, it achieves a more complete cognitive dissonance than if its seeming alienness were completely convincing. So, he at times appeared to work miracles. At one point I was trying to test him and his abilities, and I recalled that there was a box that my grandfather had given me that you opened with a little silver key that had been lost for years and years. And I said, well, if you can do anything, why don't you produce the key that to that box, which neither of us had seen even the box for a dozen years. By this time, he was naked and locked in a room at the mission. And he went and he would make these bizarre gestures, these strange, I don't know what was going on. And he went into a period of concentration, gave a wild squawk, and slammed into my hand and gave me the key. Gave me the key. He was naked. He had been locked in this room for 14 days at that time. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening to me was, I was like utterly unconcerned for his mental health or any practical concern, which was causing a lot of problems for the other people on the expedition. In classical psychology, this is called a folie à deux, a delusion of two. It's a simultaneous schizophrenic episode. It usually involves a mother and a daughter. I've never heard of a brother-brother folie à deux. But it was accompanied by all these exterior manifestations, freak rainbows, and in my case, an encounter with a UFO. And this UFO encounter had a very curious quality to it. Not that they don't always, I suppose. But this was even more curious than the pedestrian UFO encounter. What happened was, it was on the 13th day of the reversal, and I had this intimation. There was something going on about the Southwest. I wasn't clear quite what it was, and the two women on the expedition were that afternoon washing our clothes down by the Chorrera, by the lake, and I looked across the lake and I saw in the sky not a rainbow but just a spot in the sky that was a spectrogrammatic diffraction. You know, a little patch of rainbow. And I asked the women if they saw it, and they said they didn't. And then it intensified. And by this time, I was plenty in the doghouse as well. I mean, this put a great deal of strain on our small party, as you can imagine. And this spectrogrammatic iridule intensified. And then I said to them, now do you see it? And they looked, and they said, oh, yeah, it's, you know, big deal, not much, but I knew, and knowing means the voice was speaking to me. All kinds of weird things went on. I mean, I discovered that the closer I was to water, the easier it was for me to rhyme. Which I've never. And then years later, I encountered a Celtic saying, "Poetry is made at the edge of running water," and the thing would give me these aphorisms. Like one time, it said, "The clone's load is a stoned mode," and and I was not sleeping. I was now 11 days without sleep. So that night, I decided to sit by the Chorrera and just. Because I stayed up all night, and I would walk in the fields, and the thing would draw the would connect up the constellations for me and show me where they were in the sky. There was also embedded in all this thing the intimation of this thing called the teacher, which was a giant insect-like thing that was always like right over here. And there was the sense of something watching us from the sky, something moving us very, very gently but persistently toward this very weird breakthrough.
The question relates to an incident told about in both my book with Dennis, Invisible Landscape, and in True Hallucination. Creatively agitated under the influence of mushrooms, announced that he could do something, which is very hard to describe what it was. It was sort of like turn himself inside out, trigger the end of the world, open a doorway into hyperspace, something like that. Anyway, some highly touted, dramatic thing. He organized an experiment to test the theory, and the result of the experiment was not nothing, which was what I was betting on, not what he said would happen, which what he was betting on, but a very peculiar incident then was generated where he seemed to lose his mind, to put it simply, for about 3 weeks, but in a very specialized and orderly way. And I seemed to also undergo a parallel but different kind of transformation. And the theory that was being manipulated was a theory that involved using vocally produced tones to acoustically cancel metabolizing psychedelic molecules in the body so that they would bond as dimers into DNA. In other words, so that they would intercalate into DNA. The hypothesis which lie behind all this was that DNA must be the storage, the physical storage site for memories. This is not a popular idea. This is a sneered at idea. But memory is a great problem for modern science. We've decoded DNA, we've got the top quark, we've measured the core temperature of Betelgeuse. We have no idea how memory works. It's absolutely confounding because a woman, a man of 90 years old can remember the way their great-grandmother's skirts smelled when they used to crawl up into her lap when they were 4 years old. It was 86 years ago. During that time, every molecule in the body has been cycled out every 5 to 7 years. So it's 10 bodies away is the body that crawled up into that woman's lap and could smell the starch in her skirts, and yet the memory is completely clear. Where are the memories? And as you know, experiments have been done with ablating large parts of the brain or studying people who are the unfortunate victims of very traumatic head injuries. And there are cases in the medical literature of people who have fully 80% of their physical brain destroyed and no memory impairment whatsoever. So where are the memories? Well, there are a number of theories, but there is nothing more than theory at this point. Dennis said, let's assume nature is conservative for a moment. We know that nature stores protein code in DNA, and we know that DNA has large silent portions, And in fact, some of you may have seen the data which came out just recently that those large silent portions of the DNA exhibit the same mathematical properties as language. Did you all read this? Oh, this is hot news, folks. As you know, DNA codes for protein. That code is only about 6% of the DNA chain. The rest of the DNA, the other 94%, is called silent DNA, or by some people, junk DNA, because it doesn't code for proteins. So what does it do? Well, recently they've been sequencing this junk DNA and then studying it with algorithms used by the CIA to detect code in noise, and they discover that these silent portions of the DNA fit all the necessary criterion of language. They have syntactical structure. This seems to support Dennis's contention, which was, and it would be very controversial, you see, because it's a Lamarckian mechanism. It's saying that experience can modify nuclear DNA, which is denied by anti-Lamarckian evolution. That's not the way it's supposed to work, according to Darwin and the neo-Darwinians. Nevertheless, if we don't believe that the only part of the body which is not traded out many times over the course of a long lifetime, the only part of the body which you are born with and die with is neural DNA. Neural DNA, what you're born with, you keep. Therefore, it's reasonable, following good scientific method, to hypothesize that the neural DNA must be where the memories are. Well, then Dennis's idea was that ordinary experience has to do with serotonin dropping into a relationship of bonding with DNA and giving off a signal, like a radio transmitter, of the structural hyperfine ESR of the DNA, and that then constitutes the electrobiochemical foundation of the experience of thought. And so what he was saying was then what these psychedelics are is they're like different kinds of transmitters, stronger, or transmitting in different wavelengths, or transmitting with a higher bandwidth. And it is known, in fact, that these psychedelic molecules do compete with serotonin. They are serotonergic competitors. So visualize the DNA in the course of metabolism unfolding and folding itself to expose various runs of nucleotides to ribosomal coding into RNA. And in this molecular environment, these drug molecules are whirling around, and by Brownian motion or by enzymatic delivery, the details don't matter, these molecules intercalate, meaning they slip neatly between the nucleotides. Many drugs do this. This is known. But most drugs or compounds, when they intercalate into DNA, they distort the twisting of it, and it's dysfunctional. It messes up. The thing can't transcript anymore. These drug molecules, if you look at them, they're usually a pentexyl five-sided central group with two benzene rings, or a benzene ring and a partial benzene ring hanging off of this thing. And they're flat, they're planar. It means if you could blow up a psilocybin molecule to the size of a cutting board, it would be about as thin as a cutting board, and as wide and as long. Those flat molecules fit right in between the nucleotides. Yes, and when this happens, the electron spin resonance signal is amplified, just as though a more efficient transceiver had been dropped into place. And you can measure the hyperfine ESR signature of DNA in an in vitro laboratory situation. This is not mysterious. So the idea then is that we have a family of molecules, endogenous neurotransmitters like serotonin, acetylcholine, so forth and so on, and exogenous neurotransmitters like psilocybin, psilocybin, mescaline, and then exogenous, endogenous like DMT found inside and outside the body. And it may be that what the evolution of consciousness is the slow trading in of low-gain molecular transceivers like serotonin for much more broadband, high-gain molecular transceivers like DMT. So Dennis's idea was to take all this theory that I've just laid out and then use acoustically produced vocal sound to cancel the charge of these molecules. And as you probably know, or maybe you don't know, when a molecule becomes superconducting, it will bond into anything. It becomes a hyperbonding molecule. It will bond anywhere. So theoretically, if you could cause psychedelic molecules during their act of being intercalated into your genetic material to become superconducting, even for a moment, they would lock in permanently. And you would begin to have a much deeper experience of consciousness. It would be much broader, much deeper. He claimed he could do this, but he also went further and claimed, and this is where I am not good at explaining it because I didn't understand it then and I don't understand it now, but he claimed that in the act of becoming superconducting and intercalating, this thing would cause the molecule to undergo something which he named. He called it hyperdextrorotation, which means simply that it would turn inside out. And he said then that you would produce something, and, I'm embarrassed at the strangeness of the concept, but that you could, in some sense, give birth to your own soul. That something could be generated out of your body, which you would have a high degree of personal identification with, because it would, in fact, be the central essence of yourself. It would be, he made analogies to the philosopher's stone, to the flying saucer, to the birth of an idea. It's the idea that you could create what he called translinguistic matter. That means a form of, an ontological form of being which looks like matter, but which behaves like mind. And that somehow this would trigger the collapse of the illusion of history, and everything would be swept into the presence of Almighty God upon her throne, or something like that. Anyway, that was the notion. And in proceeding to carry out this experiment, which I just thought was madness and would result in nothing, and then we could go back to botanizing, instead, in a sense, it seemed to work. The condensation of the philosopher's stone and the collapse of the historical state vector is slightly delayed, but the rest of it seems right on track, in that when he threw the switch, as he said, the harmine switch, he went bonkers, basically, for about 21 days in a very complicated way, which he had anticipated. He said, there is a small chance that I will be turned inside out, not my body, but my mind. And it seemed as though that was precisely what had happened. He could recite the alphabet backwards. He spoke in a language which, if you got him to spell it, you could turn it around and you could see these were full sentences, but spoken backwards. In other words, he truly seemed to be running backwards while all the rest of us were running forward. Well, after about 21 days, that faded, and he got his act together and went back to get multiple PhDs in molecular biology, pharmacognosy, and what have you. Coincident with the throwing of the switch, I, who had been the skeptic, noticed that it was as though a switch had been thrown in me, and I began to understand. It was not like any drug I'd ever taken. It was not like psilocybin or ayahuasca. There were no hallucinations. But what began to happen was I simply began to understand faster and faster and faster and faster, so fast that I was just walking around on these jungle trails holding my head going, uh-huh, I see, yes, uh-huh, 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 uh-huh. And it was opening up ahead of me. And eventually this understanding settled down into the theory of the time wave, which I will not slay you with, because this is a course in psychobotany, not a course in megalomania revealed. But what I finally came to rest with was a complete model of space and time, which is what you would end up with if he had succeeded. He said it would condense into three-dimensional space and end history, and everyone would leave their factories and offices and discard their clothes, and with tears of joy streaming down their faces, begin to form the cosmic round dance that precedes the departure for Alpha in Sagittarius. Well, that remains a future promise to be redeemed. But what happened to me was I obtained this strange idea out of the I Ching that offered me a complete model of space and time and the future and the past, and has continued to be the touchstone of my intellectual life. So I think that, we can argue for hours, although it's probably not worth doing, about whether anything at all happened at La Chorrera. I was there. I should mention I didn't sleep for 11 days. And it was the most amazing 11 days I've ever had. I was absolutely ecstatic. I barely ate. And I was full of compassion and understanding for everyone and their limitations in this terrible dilemma, because we were, 1,000 miles up the Rio Baboon asshole with no airplanes and no radios, and here my brother proceeds to go nuts, and I'm saying it's okay, but the world may end in a few days, and on and on. It took me about 5 years to get myself publicly presentable. In that time, I was a burden to my friends and a joy to my enemies, because I appeared to be a social menace. I could back people into a Denny's and hold them there for 16 hours at a stretch with a rap so alarming and appalling that people would just back to the wall to wait to see if I was going to explode. It was simply, it takes a long time. You have to leaven it with humor and self-criticism and convince people that you don't take yourself seriously and all these things to make it palatable. Yeah, that is true hallucination. And I think this, if you want to read an eye-opening book, if you haven't read it, read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Because what you'll learn there, to your amazement, is that these great intellectual breakthroughs like Newton and Einstein and Planck and so forth, they don't come out of careful examination of the evidence and conservative adumbration of theories and all. No, they don't come like that. They come like revelations. completely, and then you argue backward to convince your colleagues. You go out and you get the evidence and you argue backward and you convince everybody, and then everybody says, well, it was obvious all the time, and anyway, they knew it 50 years earlier, and on and on and on. But that's what you have to do. So I have stuck with this, my devotion to psychedelics, because it gave me really my greatest wish, which was I want to have a complete understanding of how things work. That doesn't mean there is no more surprises, but it means you at least have a structure that you can pour it into. And I think this is what shamans do. They create a personal ideology sufficient to their needs, and my needs are complex, because I live in a society where I'm going to be talking to quantum physicists, mathematicians, historians of science, epistemologists, so forth and so on. So it had to perform at top speed. If you're in the rainforest situation, in a monoculture, then it is perhaps not so challenging. But the point of all this is catalysis of ideas. Culture can evolve no faster than its language. It can evolve no faster than the models that it can set up for itself to achieve, and that requires language. So I take the psychedelics to be catalysts of language. They probably caused it to come into existence in the first place, and then they continue to push it forward into new domains. And this great period of creativity that we're living through now in the sciences, in the arts, in the implementation of exotic technologies, I think this is the real legacy of the 60s. The people who run these fancy computer companies and the World Wide Web and the net and CERN and all that, they're all freaks. They're all people who came up through the 60s and have somehow fitted themselves in to straight society. But the great bulk of creative work in the society in those areas is being done by people who took psychedelics. And in fact, arguably, the scientists of today, the technological implementers of today, are in fact shamans. And we are creating a kind of culturally validated shamanic superspace, except we call it cyberspace. But all we're doing with the creation of cyberspace is hardwiring in a male way what has always been there in a female way. I mean, the web of invisible hidden associations that make us a cosmos instead of a chaos.